Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. One of the things that we tend to confuse, one of the things that we tend to struggle with is the idea about being literate. And when we're talking about being literate, we're not talking about being able to read and be able to write. What we're really talking about is understanding the messages that are being presented. When we say media literate and we say scientific literate, what we're really talking about is being able to understand the messages that are being presented to us, which can become very problematic when we're being bombarded with a whole host of new information on a daily basis as relates to health, as relates to wellness, as relates to the scientific understanding of how the body works. So let's go ahead and let's take a step back. Let's take a look at how do we go about becoming literate as relates to scientific understanding, as relates to be able to read the information that's being presented to us, not in the sense of being able to read, but in the sense of being able to understand what the health scientist is presenting to us. So scientific literacy skills and media literacy skills and how it impacts our understanding of health and wellness. Let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
One of the things that we keep hearing a lot is do your own research. But what's that mean? How do we go about doing our research? And this is where we have to be kind of very careful. Limited health and limited scientific literacy skills are not the same as having limited literacy. They can be related, but they're not the same. Being able to read and understand information being presented in health and science literature means being able to apply the scientific method, be able to produce a logical conclusion based off of the information that's being presented, to be able to deduce what is the meaning, what is the generalization that can come about or can come out of what I'm reading, what I'm being presented. It's about using logic to determine the accuracy and the validity of the information. It's not about being able to read or being able to write. If we approach the information using strong literacy skills, we can get a better understanding of the information and be able to determine how to best use that information. Developing literacy skills can help cut through the unfamiliarity, can cut through what is sometimes very complex terminology, very complex understandings that generally get lost when we're trying to interpret what is being presented to us, or it gets generally lost when integrated into larger news stories that we see within our media feed. Using scientific literate approaches allows us to determine the validity and the reliability of results, the validity and reliability of conclusions, the validity and reliability of recommendations that are being made, because we're able to present or follow along using logical reasoning skills. Approaching media stories in a scientifically literate and health literate fashion means not being susceptible to misinformation and disinformation that we are inundated with on a daily basis. It allows us to have a better and more educated discussion within the community and provide for a better holistic approach with our healthcare professionals. It allows us to be part of the healthcare discussion when we're looking at doing treatments. It allows us to cut through all of the noise, allows us to cut through all of the biases that we might see being presented to us. It's a skill that we struggle with as educators to get our students to understand. And it all starts with the premise of what is the scientific method. Being scientific literate means that we have to understand what is the scientific method. And yes, I understand it's going to get a lot of people to have PTSD issues and be triggered because they're going to go back to their science classes and have very bad memories about having to memorize the steps of the scientific method. But we're not looking at the scientific method in terms of the steps of the scientific method. What we're talking about when we're talking about the scientific method is we're talking about the logical process that the researchers went about in order to draw their conclusions. What was the way in which they formulated deductively the hypothesis that they're presenting? Because this is where a lot of people get the methodology wrong. And this is where even a lot of scientists get the methodology wrong. This is where a lot of health scientists get the methodology wrong. They'll tell you what the purpose of their research happens to be, but they'll never present their hypothesis. The hypothesis is the deductively reasoned out explanation for why something might occur. And it's a might. It's the explanation for why something might occur that is going to be tested through experimentation. It's not a guess, as we are taught very early in elementary education, elementary science education. It's not an if-then statement. It's not a prediction. It's an explanation. It's an explanation based off of deductive reasoning. It's the same type of deductive reasoning that we have to be able to draw on in order to formulate a rational response to questions about the topic that we're looking at in terms of health and wellness. We then go from that deductively reasoned explanation for what we observed to an experiment to test that explanation to determine whether or not the explanation is true or not. Hypotheses basically are simply true or false statements. The method by which we're able to determine the truth of that statement is based off of how the experiment is being set up. And this goes into understanding scientific literacy. Are they following a scientific approach where they're testing a hypothesis? Or are they establishing a pseudoscientific approach where they're establishing an experiment to show the hypothesis to be true? And this is where we have to be very careful in terms of how we go about reading through the methodology of the experiment that is being presented. And this is one of the skills that comes about when you become more aware of how we go about doing research. And this is not where, okay, I'm going to go do my own research, which means I'm going to go look stuff up on the internet, or I'm going to go and type it into the AI bot, which we talked about previously. When people say they're going to do their own research, what they're simply saying is they're going to do a literature search. And if you don't understand the scientific methodology as relates to whether or not what you're getting back is good science or bad science, do your own research is meaningless. What am I looking for when I want to find out if I'm testing the hypothesis or if I'm setting up an experiment to show the hypothesis to be true or not? It's about how we go about establishing various types of variable controls and various types of understandings within the experiment, so that instead of establishing experimental protocol to show something to be true, I'm establishing scientific protocols in an attempt to test the observation, to reestablish the observation in an empirical establishment where I am objectively evaluating the information, not subjectively evaluating the information. Once I have my objective information collected, the next thing I have to start looking at when I'm trying to evaluate the accuracy of the scientific method is the method of analysis that they did. And this is where I don't have to understand stats. I don't have to go and take courses on statistical analysis. I simply have to understand, are they addressing mean differences, that is the average difference within the group, or are they addressing variable differences? If I am looking at variable differences, I'm going to look for a specific type of analysis. I'm going to look for things like an ANOVA test, and that is simply just an analysis of variance amongst individuals. And this is where I'm going to look for differences pre-post. I'm going to look for differences between groups. I'm going to look for differences within groups. If I'm looking at the average difference, I'm going to look at an analysis, something like a t-test. Once again, without getting into all this statistical stuff, what we're looking at for the t-test, we're looking at what is the difference between the group averages based off the standard deviations. The other thing I have to take into account is what type of information is being collected. Am I collecting categorical information, or am I collecting numerical information? Am I collecting subjective information? Am I collecting objective information? The difference in the type of information that's being collected is going to impact the analysis that's being done. The last thing I have to look at, without getting into, once again, all the details as it relates to how to go about writing a scientific paper or doing scientific analysis, is how are they inferring their information? That is, how are they taking the analysis that they did based off the objective information that they collected? How are they inferring that information? That is, are they explaining the information based off of what is found in the literature within the larger gambit of scientific understanding? Are they applying the scientific laws? Are they applying the scientific principles to the observations that are being made, to the analysis that's being completed, to the data that's been collected? Are they putting that information into that larger understanding? If they're doing that, then they are following a pattern of information analysis known as inductive reasoning. And that's what we want. We want to see inductively reasoned out explanations to that empirical evidence. When we see that inductively reasoned out explanation, what we do is we see an author explaining how their observations fit into the larger known level of observations. When I do this inductive reasoning, I'm able to infer a conclusion. I'm able to stipulate what is actually true and what is actually true for that given set of observations, and only for that given set of observations. If that given set of observations is in agreement with the larger set of accepted observations and accepted analysis and accepted inferences, then I can add to the stipulations of what is true. And this is where we start to develop what's referred to as consensus. And that's something else that we have to look at when we start understanding our scientific literacy skills. Consensus is not a vote. Consensus is not a group of people getting together and majority rules. Consensus scientifically is where, at least when we're talking about health and wellness and physiological responses, where within the normal curve, 95% of all observations are in agreement with each other. And this is where we have to look at, okay, what is normal? What is abnormal? And yes, there's a lot of people who want us to kind of change those terminologies based off of social terms and social acceptable terms. When we're talking about norm here, what we're talking about is where within the bell curve, 95% of all individual responses fall. And so where we develop statistically a thing known as a confidence interval. And what the confidence interval is basically telling us is where is our population, 95% of our population, going to fall based off of the averages and standard deviations that are there. That 95% curve is the typical expected normal, however you want to look at it, population. This is where if I'm going to, say, track my heart rate and I want to know, is my heart rate within normal values? I want my heart rate to fall within 95% confidence interval for a normal heart rate for my age, for my biological sex, for all of the other factors that we know that are going to impact heart rate. And that's going to tell me where I fall. And that's part of understanding scientific literacy. And so when we start looking at this idea about being literate, that first step, that first acknowledgement is understanding a little bit about the scientific method. And when we start looking at the scientific method, what we're talking about outside of how we go about developing the story, what we're talking about is that cascade of events where we start with an observation. We draw a hypothesis based off of what we know. So we observe something, we make a hypothesis about why that observation occurred. We then go about developing experiments to test the hypothesis. We then go about collecting data from that experiment. We then go about doing analysis. That analysis leads to our ability to infer a conclusion. We then report our findings and our conclusions to the larger world. But that's not the end of it. And this is where understanding the next step in the scientific method becomes key when we start looking at the next step of this literacy skill, which is media literacy. One report is one report. One experiment is one experiment. We cannot make large generalizable conclusions about everybody off of a single study. And this is where the next step in the scientific method comes in. I repeat everything, or more importantly, I allow others to repeat everything. And it's that repetition that can lead to some confusion with people who say, well, scientific says this, scientific says this, scientific says this, scientific says this, where they say week A, science says that eggs are bad. Week B, science says eggs are good. Week C, science says eggs are bad. Week D, science says eggs are good. And they get confused. And the reason why they get confused is because they don't understand that step in the scientific method of repeat. It's very similar to the instructions on the shampoo bottle. We're going to wash, rinse, and repeat as necessary. And it's that as necessary part of everything that comes into play. The as necessary part that comes into play is when do we start to develop consensus? And is when consensus starts to develop that the rate of experimentation starts to slow down. Unless we start getting contradictory or nonconformity responses or nonconformity actors within the scientific community. And there are nonconformists within the scientific community. These are the individuals who will go about doing experimentations in an attempt to show that there's something wrong with the conclusions that are being drawn. And there's nothing wrong with that. And scientists who are good scientists welcome that. That's one of the things that's going to separate the scientific side of everything from the pseudoscientific side of everything. In the scientific side of everything, we are welcoming challenges. Challenges are good because challenges are going to make us have to defend our position. They're going to have to defend our conclusions. They're going to have us go and redo experimentations in an attempt to see, do we see the same results? Do we see the same, are we able to draw the same conclusions from those same results that we see? It's not where we're done with experimentations once we have a conclusion that can be drawn. And that's one of the things that gets lost when we start to oversimplify a lot of the stuff we discuss when it comes to health and wellness, when it comes to the scientific understanding of how the human body works. It's the oversimplification that a lot of times gets presented within textbooks. And because it's presented in textbooks, a lot of students will assume that the oversimplification is the correct identification of what's going on without being able to or understanding the larger context that the oversimplification is coming from. It's the oversimplification that gets presented within a lot of the media feeds that we get. And the problem with the oversimplification is that we tend to get a lot of presentations, a lot of faulty justifications, from hosts presenting messages about health problems, health solutions that sound scientifically valid, but when we actually take a step back and look at it, they're simply perpetuating a fallacious hypothesis, a fallacy. It's a reliance on specific logical fallacies, whether those be post hoc fallacies or reliance on anecdotes or circular thinking that become the rational basis for what they're presenting. And when we're looking at the ever-growing list of snake oils and cure-alls, and this program is going to help you lose this weight, and this program is going to help you lose that weight, and this is what I did to lose 70 pounds. And all you got to do is take this GLP-1 medicine and everything's going to be, all of those things rely upon or can rely upon fallacies and fallacious hypotheses and fallacious conclusions because they come from logical fallacies. The messaging and misinformation and disinformation can be countered by healthcare providers and healthcare students that are willing to take a step back and logically deduce and logically induce conclusions from observations, not just accept what is there, not just rely upon their personal heuristics about what should be recommended, their personal anecdotes, their personal perspectives about life as to what should be recommended. A point reached only through applying the scientific theories, the scientific laws, the scientific principles that will explain why something is occurring. Where we get into a bit of a conundrum because the oversimplification becomes the problem. And most of us don't have the training or academic background to determine what is true and what is false based on what's being presented, particularly when we simply get short snippets of information. And we cannot differentiate between what is information versus what is disinformation, what is misinformation. And when we can't do that, it becomes intentional oversimplification. And the intentional oversimplification leads to the gluttony of misinformation and disinformation that is out there. And this is where we have to, once again, take a step back and say, okay, I'm not an expert on everything. I may be an expert on one thing. And since I'm an expert on one thing, I'll be able to rely upon my expertise in that one thing to determine the truth or falsehood of statements. If I'm not an expert in everything, I can't state with any type of veracity what is absolutely true outside of my area of expertise. And this is where we have to understand, where do I fall on the Dunning curve? And that is, where do I understand in terms of my level of expertise versus my level of understanding and ability to understand what is true and what is false and explain what is true and what is false. When we start looking at this information, this is where we have to understand what can we do in terms of approaching the information. The vastness of information out there in the public forum leads us back to how can we go about addressing information in such a way that we can kind of understand two things about the human body before we get into getting media literate. The two things we have to understand about the human body is this. First, it's a Rube Goldberg. It is a huge contraption that is excessively complex and excessively complex just to do fundamentally simple things. And it's the excessive complexity and the number of regulatory factors and regulatory features within that complexity that means one small little change may change a single step within the complexity, but it doesn't lead the complexity back to being simple, nor does it make it everything okay. That is, we cannot make one small little change in everything and expect that one small little change from everything to make a change in everything. And yes, I understand there's a lot of everythings in the statement right there. Because of the complexity that we see within the way in which the human body works and the attempt that it uses to maintain its optimal performance, its health, its homeostasis, we have to understand that we can't stipulate a single factor or a single thing is going to be the root cause or root cure for the ills or the disease that we're trying to counteract. And that's where we can use what little expertise we have and our ability to logically think out what is being presented to us to differentiate the messaging that's being presented to us. Is that scientific literacy, the ability to apply and understand the scientific method and understand what it means to have a scientific consensus that is going to help us understand what is taking place in terms of how our body's functioning, how we can make small changes in multiple things within our body that's going to help improve our overall health and help improve our overall optimal functions, and lay the groundwork for understanding how to go about logically deducing and inducing inferences based off of observations that we're making. When we utilize our scientific understandings, we're able to understand that when someone says what science says, we're not strictly looking at the specific principles, the specific theories, the specific laws of science. What we're doing is we're saying this is what the empirical evidence supports. The scientific laws and the scientific theories and the scientific principles are there to explain why stuff occurs. And that's why it's more important to understand the why than to accept the what and the how. If I understand the why, if I'm able to go into the literature, if I'm able to read through the review article, if I'm able to go and look at the encyclopedic data, if I'm able to gather the why something happens, I'm able to understand what and how, and I'm able to counter the what and how that's being sold to me by the misinformation and by the disinformation. Being scientifically literate allows us to understand nutritional and dietary recommendations. It allows us to grasp the fallacies of centering dietary and nutritional advice on calories, even if that is the dietary storytelling that we like to tell. It allows us to understand why we have to have periodization in our exercise in order to have continuous progressive improvements. It allows us to understand what types of molecules must be consumed in order to have proper metabolism, in order to maintain optimal performance. It's a requirement that we need to use if we hope to counterbalance the presentation of information that is being fed to us through social media, through news reports, through YouTube videos, through even podcasts like this one, where if you're being told this is what you should have, this is how you should have, this is what you should do, this is how you should do, without the explanation for why, they're not focusing on the scientific literacy side of everything. They're telling you what their heuristic, what their personal antidote, what their personal perspective happens to be, not what is or what should be valid. Validity and truthfulness that can only come through the application of those scientific principles, those applications of the scientific laws, those applications of the scientific theories that get lost when we have the oversimplification. Which takes us into the other part of the whole literacy aspect that we have to worry about. We start looking at this idea about the information and disinformation, misinformation that's out there. And that's looking at the idea about media literacy. And the idea within this media literacy is, how can I determine the strength of the evidence that's being presented to me? What's the difference between a scientific article, a news article, or a social media post, or a podcast, or a YouTube video? What's the difference? The difference is the peer reviewing that takes place. Scientific articles and scientific publications provide an avenue to have peers, other experts, be able to judge, hopefully impartially judge, and evaluate a manuscript that for its accuracy and for its reliability, not whether I agree with the person or not. The peer review process is not about do I agree with the author, it's do I agree with their inferences? Do I agree with their logical rationale? Do I agree with how they're going about doing their analysis? That is the key difference when we start looking at this idea between the media and the scientific media in terms of what is being presented. Peer review tends to come through a very rigorous means of research and various rigorous means of ability to present a conclusion so that as a community we can state with a high degree of certainty that what is true is true. Very rarely do we see that type of rigor within the news media. Yes, there is vetting that takes place within the news media. Most of that vetting is not about accuracy, at least not accuracy the way in which you think about it in terms of scientific accuracy. The vetting that we're looking at, we look at coming through the news media, is vetting about the authenticity of the statements more than the accuracy of the statements. And that is almost non-existent in the social media atmosphere. A few of us who are producing educational materials like this will provide references, provide articles that you can use to understand where we're getting the information that we are reliant upon. With the news media, you may get one or two references. Within scientific communications, we stand on giants. It's one of the things that I teach my students is we stand on the shoulders of the giants. We stand on everybody who came before us. And we have to stipulate to our readers, where did the information come from? Who provided the information? And we're not quoting authors, we're not quoting manuscripts. What we're doing is we're saying, these sources provided me the rationale for making the statement that I'm making. This is where I got my information to deductively reason out my response. It's important because we have to be able to expand our understanding of what's there. That's what's coming through the scientific articles. Within the social media posts, however, what we tend to get is we tend to approach questions from a biased perspective. Presentation of opinions as the rationale for understanding, as opposed to the scientific basis for why we're doing stuff. Going back to the principles tell us what is there and how to go about looking at what is there. There was a very good article in Science back in 2022 that details how to go about reading through the scientific articles, reading through the news articles to look for what is being presented in terms of its overall importance, in terms of its overall veracity, in terms of its overall reliability. And what we have to remember is that we all depend upon the expertise of others. We are relying on the credibility of the authors and the reviewers or the editors to correctly represent what is true knowledge. We have to do this in an attempt to choose a trusted source of media, a trusted source of information. And this is where we get into a lot of the hot button social, hot button political discussions about fake news. I hate the term. It's storytelling versus news. There's nothing fake about news. News is information. It's the storytelling that becomes bias, and it's the bias that becomes the misinformation, and the bias within the misinformation becomes the disinformation. There's an increasing amount of concern about the trust within science and the trust within information that science is presenting because of the bias, because of the presentation of misinformation that becomes disinformation. The misinformation likes to thrive by appealing to the mythological idea that science, the mythical idea about science, that science somehow has the ability to know everything, but is unable to know everything. And this is where we have to start looking at and evaluating the credibility of the information that we're getting. How credible is it? Is the information there scientific information, misinformation, or is it information that is possibly going to debunk the information that is being kind of moved from house to house, ear to ear, brain to brain within the population? What is the information that is being presented? What is the credibility of that information to provide truth within the information that is there? Or is it simply telling a biased story? What's the best tool that we can use in order to make informed choices? This is where we have to develop specific literacy skills. And we start looking at developing specific literacy skills. It's not just the scientific literacy skills. It's understanding that while we're trying to seek out an answer, we're not an expert. And we have to be able to rely upon the expertise of others to speak the truth as to why and how something is occurring. And once again, it's that why issue that comes to play when we start looking at how the human body functions and how health and wellness is developed and or lost. That why is contained within the principles of physiology. That why is contained within the scientific laws that govern the principles of physiology. And it's those principles, it's those laws, it's those theories that are providing the rationale, the explanation for why stuff is taking place. What you have to be able to do is you have to be able to become a competent reader of scientific information. And what are three components to this understanding? The social practices that the scientific community relies upon. The ability to develop consensus not based off of popular opinion or vote, but based off of what is the 95% confidence interval for the observations. What is the criteria that it takes to have scientific expertise? And then we have to go and look at what are my digital media skills? What are my digital media literacy skills in particular? Knowledge and awareness is essential to developing competency required to interrogate the truthfulness and the trustworthiness of both the information as well as the source of the information necessary to evaluate the claims being made. And this is where we have to look at what are the aspects of media literacy that we have to rely upon. And I'm going to rely upon a nice kind of schematic that is brought up from the U.S. Department of Education's media literacy program, where we start off with how do we go about sourcing our information, what is referred to as information literacy. This is where do I search for? How do I find? How can I evaluate and analyze the accuracy and the reliability of information? Am I simply getting the first few hit returns off of a Google search? Or am I going into the databases for the journals? Am I going to credible sources for that information? This is where I get into a next set of literacy skills, and that is my data literacy. That is, how can I manage the information that's being provided to me? How can I set up my online presence so that I understand and recognize content? How I understand and recognize information? The most powerful aspect of literacy skills, whether it is simple, true reading literacy skills, or whether it is scientific literacy skills, or whether it is media literacy skills, is the reflection side of this. And that is the critical thinking. And that is the ability to understand, analyze, and critically evaluate the information. In this, I have to rely upon the shoulders of everybody who came before me. I have to brace myself off of what are the scientific principles, what are the scientific laws, what are the scientific theories that are going to explain or allow me to explain an observation that's being made, or analyze information that's being presented to me from somebody else's observations. How do I go about critically evaluating the information to develop an opinion that is informed, an opinion that is unbiased? And the only way to get an opinion that is informed and unbiased is to step away from any type of logical fallacy and focus purely on deductive and inductive reasoning skills, minimizing the number of assumptions that are within my critical thinking. I've had a number of students say, "Oh, you're a mad scientist the way that you go about doing stuff." It's not that I'm a mad scientist, I'm a scientist. And I'm a scientist that is utilizing deductive reasoning skills to apply the principles, to apply the scientific laws, to apply the scientific theories to the topic that we're covering. If I'm able to apply and correctly apply without presenting a logical fallacy, a correctly deductively reasoned hypothesis, or a correctly inductively reasoned conclusion, regardless of whether I agree with it or not, I have to accept it. That is what is missing with a lot of the literacy skills that come into play. And that goes into looking at the credibility for information. And should I reject it or should I accept it in terms of providing me with the rationale to develop the correct opinion? And this is where we start looking at, is the source of information credible? And the credibility of evidence is the indication of no conflicts of interest. Or if there happens to be a conflict of interest, an indication of potential conflicts of interest. What is being acknowledged as the developmental source of information? Is it presenting an unbiased avenue of analysis for the topic? If any one of those points comes back as no, I have to reject it. If I see something that has no conflict of interest, or has stipulated a conflict of interest, has acknowledged the source of the material that provides the foundation for their information, and shows an unbiased analysis, I have to accept that source as a credible source. The next thing I have to address is, does the source have expertise to vouch for the claim? That is the author, or does the author have a track record? Is there a reputation amongst peers that the author has a knowledge base? Are there credentials being presented, or there are assumed credentials for the individual? Is there relevant professional experience and expertise? Once again, if I answer no to any of those statements, then I have to reject the source. If, however, I answer yes to those questions in terms of the expertise of the author, then I have to accept the source. Now, there's some authors like myself who don't like to put all of our alphabet soup after our name in an attempt to minimize any type of stress that might come about from looking at the alphabet soup after our names. But the reputation that we have in the authorship comes from the authorship and comes from the multiple publications that we may be referencing within our work that is independent of the credentials after our name. Is there some sort of institutional context that allows me to have expertise. And once again, if I answer yes to those, then I have to accept the source. Is there a consensus amongst relevant scientific experts? And this is where we have a not necessarily automatic rejection. And that's because it goes back to that idea about the scientific method, which is where we are constantly undergoing that revision process, that process where we are constantly re-examining, are the conclusions correct or not? And this is where we have an ever-expanding wealth of scientific information, scientific understanding. And this is where instead of automatically rejecting, if we have a no on the consensus, we start to probe for that uncertainty. And that probing of uncertainty is, what is the disagreement that's being presented? What is the means by which the disagreement is showing the disagreement? Is it done in a logical fashion? Is it done without presenting any fallacies? Is it done showing deductively and inductively reasoned out arguments? Is it showing the range of possibilities? Is it showing the plausibility of the conclusion? Does it stipulate the risk for being wrong? If I answer no in all of those to all of those, then I have to reject it. However, if there's even one yes within that probe for uncertainty, then I have to accept the source. Accepting that source allows me to inquire about explanations. It allows me to inquire about the degree of certainty or uncertainty that might exist within the gambit of information that is out there. And that's where the contrarian is going to fit in. The contrarian is going to fit in on that last step. And in that last step, one of the things we have to look at is the idea novel? Is it expanding our understanding? Or is it simply somebody being a contrarian? And this is where we have to be careful within a lot of the media feeds, because someone's going to present something that is contrary to the common wisdom. And when we present something that is contrary to the common wisdom, but we don't have justification for it, we cannot accept it. It's simply just somebody selling us something. If they cannot explain the why and they only give you the what, if they cannot explain the why and they only gave you the how, then we have to reject it. However, if it's a novel voice, if it's a novel voice claiming that there is some question out there that isn't quite addressed, then we have to accept the source. And that accepting the source isn't in itself the end of everything. However, what we have to do is to be very careful when we accept that, is that lack of evidence and evidence of lack are two different things. If I lack evidence, then there is still exploration to take place. However, if there's evidence of lack, then I have to conclude that the lack is the correct thing. That is, if I don't know something, and all of a sudden I get presented with something that is, here is new information. That new information fills in that gap of I don't know something. Which is different than there's nothing to be known. The evidence of lack is strong. The evidence of lack says that there is nothing there. However, lack of evidence creates a rabbit hole. It creates an area for exploration to take place. And that's where a lot of the pseudoscientific approach can kind of weasel its way into our scientific understanding of what's going on. Because they'll then present a logical fallacy within the debate in between lack of evidence or evidence of lack, that it is a lack of evidence. And since it's a lack of evidence, then my position must be correct because you lack evidence. But the problem with that is that they actually have to present the evidence to show that it's evidence of lack, not lack of evidence. And that's where they get lost within the conundrum, within the difference between a pseudoscientific approach and a scientific approach. That lack of evidence, the contrarian's viewpoint, is where we can make some of the largest leaps in scientific understanding that we have, because we're allowing ourselves to fill in the gaps of our understanding. It also allows us to change perspectives. One of the things that I teach, one of the things that kind of throws a lot of people for loops, is when I talk about body weight issues. And whenever we talk about body weight issues, everybody talks about caloric balance. But the problem is that the caloric balance is not the correct avenue to address weight issues. And that's because the assumption is that everything that has to deal with body weight is about energy and energy use by the cells within the body. If that was the case, then we would not have any nutrients to build with. And since we would not have any nutrients to build with, we would not be able to grow. And so when we start having these contrarian viewpoints, such as that one right there, it's not where we're trying to disprove or show fault with the viewpoint. What we're doing is we're trying to correct the viewpoint to present a better scientific understanding for what is there, which allows us to develop novel ideas and novel understandings. And one of the things we have to remember when we start looking at this media literacy and the scientific literacy and the combination of the two when understanding how the human body works and understanding health and wellness is that we have to have principles, we have to have laws, we have to have theories that can be used to explain observations. We cannot observe, we cannot analyze without having the appropriate correct principles, the appropriate correct theories, the appropriate correct laws to allow me to have the explanation, to allow me to have the rationalization or the rationale to rationalize why something is occurring. Without that, we're going to run the risk of having logical fallacies. Without that, we're going to run the risk of making too many assumptions. And in either case, it's going to hurt the arguments that I'm trying to make. It's going to hurt my understanding. It's going to damage the ability for me to understand what is going on within my body, what is the best option to make in order to have better health, in order to have better wellness, in order to optimally perform, in order to overcome a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we face on a daily basis. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully, got a little bit out of the conversation as relates to literacy skills and the importance of literacy skills as relates to health and wellness, as relates to understanding how the human body works. Please make sure that you're following us here on the podcast. Please make sure you're following us on YouTube. Give us that big thumbs up. Give us that 5-star rating. Give us that like. Let us know that we're doing a good job. Leave comments. Be more than happy to take a look at any of the comments that you have and expand upon any of the previous episodes that we've recorded. Also follow us with our written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post every once in a while to Instagram and to Threads. Stay tuned for future conversations about how the human body functions, health and wellness, as well as a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we are trying to overcome.